All right. Let's see. I guess I can't say raise your hand if you're not back, but hopefully folks have rejoined us. We got a bunch of duns there. Um, so just a few questions maybe to get us started off here. And Sandy, not to pick on you, but this is obviously a topic that's probably pretty close to things that you deal with. So if you particularly have anything to throw in, feel free. But first of all, just from a general perspective, having read that introduction, does anybody have maybe a good quick answer to just what does it mean to talk about Gestalt in terms of graphic design or visual design? Wow. All right. So basically, just what is Gestalt? What did you pull out of that summary there? Any volunteers? Yes, go ahead.
So I pulled out of there that it is more of like a visual preference or how something looks to the eye for the person who's viewing it, and it talks about how when things are grouped together in certain ways, that it can allow for easier understanding of what is being looked at. And I saw there was a kind of a quote in there that I've heard before that the whole is nothing other than the sum of its parts.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it's actually the whole is other than the sum of its parts. Right. Yeah. Just meaning that we take these bits and pieces in a visual construction, and while when we're building it, we may be focused on the individual elements. That what we know about the way that human beings actually process visually is not at the individual element level, but more holistically. That's Gestalt means sort of all. So the idea is that we as creatures, as animals that process visual input, that the way that we do it is generally focused, at least initially, on the big picture, on how everything assembles. Yeah, Melissa, a lot like a mosaic, or one of my favorite um, Broadway shows, which relates to a painting, is a painting by George Seurat, which is a pointillist painting, where it's a whole bunch of individual little dots, but when you step back, you see it as an entire image as opposed to a bunch of little dots. So that's basically what we're talking about here, is that if you're going to be designing visual products that are supposed to be instructional, um, and it says, I think in the middle section there, it said pictures are information. This is the reason we would put a graphic on a page, is so that our students get information out of it. And that if we're going to do that effectively, that we need to understand how people actually process that information. Um, yeah, how the elements are put together. Yes, yeah. And when I was thinking about tonight's class, I mean, obviously this one topic of graphic design, people get entire degrees in just this one topic. So the fact that we're condensing this discussion down into essentially one evening's class is on one perspective a little ridiculous. So yeah, I sort of focused on Gestalt as one opening into this, but yes, there are all sorts of collections of design principles that go into this as well. But I thought this was a nice kind of big picture look at this, in a way to maybe for people who have not really thought too much about the way that they structure visual elements, to give them a way to look at it. Um, that's sort of the overview of this. The specifics are that they've taken this philosophy or psychology or concept and developed a bunch of, some people call them rules, um, or laws that come out of this idea that if the idea is if the core concept is that we tend to process visual elements in groups and as connected to each other, how are the different ways that we can control how people group that information and how they process it? So what I'm going to do, the next little thing, segmentation instruction through, yeah, yep. This segmentation it ties into this definitely. You can think of a single graphic design and how you segment that individual design in terms of grouping elements on the page or leading your viewer's eye through the elements on a page in a way that's supposed to make sense to them. Um, so yeah, Melissa, absolutely, connection to that segmentation idea. So there are a lot of design principles that come out of this. I found some articles that got up to 9 or 10 or 11. Others were really just focusing on 4 or so. So I pulled out 5 that were pretty consistent across a lot of the different resources on Gestalt. And the next 5 pages of this handout just provide sort of a page on each. I'm not going to sit here and read each of the pages to you. I just want to overview each one. And then what we're going to do next is I'm going to set you guys loose on an activity. It'll be an individual activity for tonight. So last week we did the small groups. This one will be on your own, where you're going to take one of these laws and try to find an example online that is either a good example of the use of that law or a bad example of the use of that law. And we're going to create a little database on Moodle. So this will also be a way for you to experience using a Moodle activity, the Moodle database activity, and kind of see how that works. So you'll be filling in some examples, some visual examples for us to look at of these laws. So I just want to overview them first, and then I'll get into the specifics of the activity, and then I'm going to cut you guys loose for a little while to do that database activity. So here are the 5 laws we're going to focus on tonight. The first is similarity. Just means that if there are things in our visual field that share similar characteristics, that we will tend to group those together. Our brain will try to assemble those and put those as belonging together with each other. They don't have to be identical. They just have to have similar characteristics. So the visual example here are the 2 dogs, the Great Dane and the Chihuahua. The first one, not much similar there. They're different sizes, they're different colors, they're facing different directions. In the second one, though, we've got basically the same 2 dogs, but now they're both the same color, they're both wearing red collars, they're both positioned the same way, facing with their heads to the left. So those 2, in a situation where there's a page full of dogs, those 2 dogs we would group together, even if they weren't near each other. We would see them as belonging to a group. All right, so that is basically what similarity is about. And then there's a little bit about applying that law, some things to think about. The second law is proximity. And this is maybe the easiest one to grasp because this is literally just that when things are near each other, we tend to group them. So unlike the first one where things could be far apart, but as long as they shared something, we would group them. Here, elements can be completely different from each other, but if they are grouped physically together, we will tend to put those together. So they could be, I know the example on this page, they are all the same, but it could have been shapes that were all different shapes. But as long as they're located next to each other, we tend to group those things together and process them as a group as opposed to a bunch of individual elements. So that's proximity. Closure, this is kind of a neat one. Our brains tend to fill in the gaps, even if there's something that's not there on the page. So in that first image, it's probably not much of a stretch to see a five-pointed star, even though there is no star there. What's actually there are five Pac-Mans that are all facing each other. But our brains just tend to connect the dots and tend to fill in the gaps. A practical example at the bottom is it's similar to the World Wildlife Federation, their logo. But that panda bear, we all see a panda bear, but if you really take a look at what's going on there, it's really just a bunch of blobous shapes, but something in our brain fills in the missing outlines and completes the shape for us. So closure a lot of times has to do with being able to simplify. You can realize that you don't have to put everything there and clutter a page up. You can sometimes get away with removing certain elements and rely on the fact that your viewer will still complete it. Continuity. This is another interesting one, that our brains also tend to keep an object continuous, even if it's not continuous on the page. So things like lines, curves, things like that, if a line has started, particularly if that line has a arrow on the end of it, our mind will fill in and will keep that line moving in that direction until it runs into something. So an arrow is so powerful because even if it doesn't touch the thing it's pointing at, it forces our brains and makes our eyes move towards the object that it's pointing at. Things like hands pointing. Eyes are another key one in this, and faces in graphics. If you have information on a page and have a person's photograph on the page, if that photograph is looking away from your content, you're going to confuse your viewer because they are going to try to look somewhere else. So you always try to have eyes, if there are eyes or faces on a visual, that they're pointing towards the content you want them to point towards. So that's continuity. And then the last one is figure and ground. And you've probably all seen examples of this where you can trick your eye into believing that one part of an image is the background and the other is the foreground, but then also flip that and see the background as the foreground and vice versa. So this is important in terms of design, because if you want your viewer to know what they're supposed to focus on, you need to make sure that the foreground and the background are clear and that they're not ambiguous, because you don't want to create that disconnect in your viewer in terms of what it is they're supposed to be paying attention to. So there's
Professor Miller,
yes, go ahead.
so what we're looking at here, like it looks to me like an upside down Batman or whatever, but like those are poor examples because we can't distinguish between where our eyes focus.
Exactly. Yeah. In this case, what I wanted to show was if you make it ambiguous, how that creates that tension in the viewer that you may not want. I mean, it could be interesting if you were an artist and creating a graphic you wanted someone to interact with in that way.
Right.
But typically speaking, from an instructional standpoint, you don't want ambiguity. You want your consumer of your content to know what they're supposed to focus on.
Okay, thank you.
So yeah, so this shows up in instructional materials. It can show up sometimes when backgrounds get too busy and they tend to distract from whatever the material is that's in the foreground. Sometimes choosing colors that are laid on top of each other, things like that. So these two examples are both cases where that figure and ground are ambiguous. But from an instructional standpoint, you would try to stay away from that ambiguity. Okay. So there are other laws, and depending on which resource you look at, there are additional ones. But these five, I think, are sort of the ones that show up the most. So what I thought we would do, in order to combine several things sort of into one, is to have each of you pick one of these five. All right. And I thought about assigning people to the 5. I think I'm going to just leave it to fate tonight. So, having seen these 5 in overview, if there's one that particularly caught your eye or one that you know you've got an example of, pick that one. This document we're looking at is on the Moodle, so you can pull it up and maybe read in more detail the page about that law that you've picked. Then, and this is where I'm trying to combine a couple things into one, back on our Moodle page, I've got a database activity called Gestalt Principles in Graphic Design. And the idea is for you to take the law that you want to focus on. You're going to locate a graphic or image. Hopefully it can be instructional, but if you get stuck and you can't find a good instructional one, then feel free to use anything you can find. And the example can either be a positive example or a negative example. So say if you're doing the foreground background, you could either be looking for something where the designer did a really good job of making the background and the foreground clear so that you really knew what you were supposed to be looking at. Or you may come across an example where it's not so good. Maybe the background gets in the way. So you can look for either. Just pick one or the other. You don't have to find an example of both unless you really want to. But I'm really just looking for either a good example or a bad example of whatever law you've created or whatever law you've chosen. And then what you're going to do is add an entry into our database. This is going to be similar to the glossary activity that we did. The difference between the glossary and the database is that a glossary is sort of just a single posting of information. A database is usually several fields, and each field is designed to hold a particular kind of information. So when you add an entry, you're going to give the name of the principal, so just whichever one you've picked. Give a quick description of the principal. I'm looking for maybe one sentence here of what the principal is about. Then there's a container for the image itself. So when you found an image online, usually the easiest thing to do if you're on a Mac, if you click and hold on an image, you will get something that pops up that will say save image, and you can save the image to your desktop and then simply drag that image right here into this box. And then upload it. I'm just realizing that for some reason. All right, I'm noticing here for some reason there's supposed to be one more field down here for you to enter things into, and for some reason, at least in mine here, it's not giving me the option to. So I'm not going to get stuck. What this last field was supposed to be about was just giving a quick couple of sentences about how the principle you chose or the law you chose in the example you chose might have impacted the instructional or educational effectiveness of that thing. So if it's a good example, you can say, the foreground and background were clear, which meant that the viewer knew what material they were supposed to be looking at. Or this was a bad example of foreground and background, which would have confused the viewer into knowing what material they were supposed to be looking at. So since this field seems to not be working, put that information just up in the description field. So give one sentence description and then another sentence or two about how your example would impact the instructional effectiveness of that. Am I being clear enough? I feel like I'm not.
No, I got it, Professor Miller. I'm just curious, like if we choose to use this type of assignment on our Moodle, Am I understanding correctly? Like we actually pick the different fields that for like students to add, and we could name them and stuff.
That is correct. Yes, in a database, you structure the database first by selecting. There's maybe a half a dozen different types of fields you can put in. There's simple text fields. There's long text fields. There's file fields. There's some others. I think there's one related to maybe formulas or something like that. So yeah, ahead of time, if you were using this activity, you would give some thought to what types of things you would want your students to put into the entry. And then typically on a database, what that lets you do is then arrange that information visually in a particular way. Sometimes they call it a report or something like that. So then you could take this raw information and then format it in different ways because it is separate fields. You could graphically move the fields around or decide which ones you wanted to display. All right. So this is what I would like us to do next. This is an individual activity, so I am going to kind of cut everybody loose for a period of time in order to complete this activity and maybe also get a chance to take a bit of a break and so on. So again, the bottom line is choose one of the laws, one of the 5 laws. You can read the page about that law on the Moodle document if you want to brush up and let me get back to that. So if you go to the theory overview, that page is the one that'll have the individual pages. So take a look at the law you've chosen. Then search around the web a little bit. See if you can find an example that's either a good example or a bad example of the law you've chosen. Copy that image to your desktop. Come back, create your database entry with the name of it and the information about it. And then upload the image there. Since people probably won't be doing the database right away, I'm going to try to fix that field. So hopefully that educational impact field will be a separate field, in which case just give me a couple sentences there. Oh, they're already announcing 2-hour delays, huh? See what happens. All right. So any other questions about the activity itself? All right. So let's do this. It is just after 6 o'clock now. I want to give people enough time to complete this, to get a chance to do some searching online, to find an example that they want to use, to get the database entry made, and also maybe get a little chance to take a bit of a break. So let's say 6. Let's see. Yeah, let's say 6:50. So basically 45 minutes. Does that seem reasonable? Okay. All right. Yeah, I figured this should probably take maybe a half an hour or so to complete, and then that'll also hopefully give you 10-15 minutes to just take a little bit of a break. So let's meet back here at 6:50. I am going to leave the room open. I'm going to step away from the computer for a few minutes, but if you have a question while you're doing the activity, please feel free to drop in. And if I'm not here right at that moment, leave a message in the chat, and I'll get back to you. So I'll keep monitoring things, but I am going to step away for a few minutes, and I'm going to try to fix that field in the database activity. All right. So I will see folks back here at 6:50. Enjoy.